Mr. Prashad, how would you characterize Russia's military operation against Ukraine? A defensive or an aggressive war? An imperialist or anti-imperialist intervention?
It's a very good question that you've asked. And let's put it this way. This is part of the kind of ideological dispute about what's happening in Ukraine. Let's be very clear. Russia is a country that was humiliated in the 1990s. When in 1991 the Soviet Union collapsed, Boris Yeltsin, who effectively was the instrument of that collapse alongside Mikhail Gorbachev, but really Boris Yeltsin as the party secretary in Moscow and so on, Boris Yeltsin effectively allowed US think tanks, US foundations, US based financiers like George Soros to come and bankrupt the country and construct a system that allowed a few billionaires to take over state assets. It was the United States advisors that created the oligarchs in Russia. Very interesting, the word oligarch. Nobody calls Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos oligarchs. It's only Russian billionaires who get called oligarchs. Anyway, this was a US made system. Okay, everybody knows that. And the country was humiliated. Up till the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, Russia's political class had been asleep, including Mr. Putin, who was the president in the first period after Yeltsin from 91 till about 2007. He was not pushing forward a global agenda. During the time of the financial crisis, Mr. Putin went to the Munich Security Conference in 2007. And it's at Munich that he said, we will allow no single master. And then the Russians put on the table that NATO must not come any further east towards the Russian border. What the Russians said then, Breno, is important to remember. Number one, the US had unilaterally withdrawn from the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. Russia saw that as a threat. Secondly, the United States violated the handshake agreement made between James Baker and Edward Shevardnadze, who was then the foreign minister of the USSR, that NATO would not expand beyond Germany's eastern border after the unification of Germany. That handshake agreement had been violated. So a combination of these two things, anti-ballistic missile and the handshake agreement violation, number of countries in Eastern Europe joining NATO, put a lot of pressure on the Russians. They feared that the United States was going to come and undermine their quote-unquote sphere of influence. Right after that, there was a conflict in Georgia between the Russians and the Georgians over border regions. Well, that was to some extent sorted out. Part of that had to do with a lot of influence of the Europeans in Georgia to kind of peel Georgia into the European project. So things were pretty stable after that, Breno, in fact. But then we come to something interesting in Ukraine, which becomes the next instrument of, or the next theater of the conflict. The United States pretty openly comes and overthrows a government which was not pro-Russian per se. The government that was overthrown, in fact, was pretty independent. It wanted to be part of Europe and part of the Russian sphere and so on. But the United States overthrows that government in 2014. Victoria Nuland, whose name I've already mentioned, walking around the Maidan saying, we want XYZ to be the next president. This person should meet him. I mean, it's crude. That audio tape is crude, where she says, this is what must happen. It was clear to the Russians that the United States had a project in Ukraine. But then when Trump unilaterally withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, the INF Treaty in 2019, it was at that point that Putin said that Russia needs security guarantees. Because, look, the question isn't Ukraine joining NATO. The question is the United States placing intermediate nuclear missiles in Ukraine. That was unacceptable. So in that sense, was this war provoked? Of course it was provoked. Certainly was provoked. Was it a good idea for Russian troops to cross the Donbass region into the rest of Ukraine? Well, that we'll understand in 5 years. It's very difficult to understand that now. There's a stalemate. people are getting very badly. There's a lot of damage being inflicted on Russia's forces and on the Ukrainian people. Nobody seems to be making, enormous gains despite the entry soon for the spring of German tanks from Poland and Germany, and also US Abrams tanks. Tanks, what are they talking about? This was not a debate about tanks, Breno, because you see, when the Russian army entered, you saw the images of tanks entering, but the tanks were quickly destroyed by the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Russia right now is not sending its tanks in, it's firing missiles. So this question of getting Germany to accede to have their tanks sent to Ukraine was not about the tanks. It was about making sure the West was politically united in its campaign against Russia.